Kessler from Revolution, editor-at-large.
James Marks, Phillips, UK.
Pleasure
to have you.
Welcome to the top tier of the London watch trade.
Thank you very much indeed.
Was there a moment where you realized you were addicted to watches?
To watches in general, no. But I think I remember being around 7 years old. A relative of mine had a Swatch collection. I remember looking at those watches and they just resonated with me. It was something, it wasn't, later on we look at the mechanicals, is it quartz, is it hand wound, etc. It was the aesthetics of it, when you were 7 that really appealed to that. And I started to collect Swatch as a very young guy. All the way till I was 17, and the whole mechanical watching hadn't really clicked into place. But when I say I became addicted to watches was probably when I started to get into vintage. When I started to collect vintage Daytona, it was still kind of a bit of a nerdy thing. I was in finance and it was a release from that, but it was also, you had time to sort of look into, there was forums and there was sort of chatter. And there was something quite cool about the fact that Daytonas had all these little nuances that really appealed to me.
But you surely didn't start with Daytonas and Rolexes.
No, I don't think anyone particularly starts on a model. I think you fall into that.
Do you remember what your first vintage purchase was?
Yeah, it was an Explorer 2. It was a white dial Explorer 2.
Okay.
I loved it because, again, I had seen the watch in a magazine. And it was all regarding Norman Foster, with him wearing that watch with a building in the background. And I thought that is such a cool, crisp design. It almost wasn't Rolex, it was sort of white dialed, it was everything that I didn't sort of, at the time, didn't believe Rolex was. And that was the one that really sort of got me into Rolex.
Was anyone or anything influencing you, or was this a path on discovery entirely on your own?
No, I wasn't particularly influenced by anyone. I think it was just a case of there was an aesthetics there that appealed. And then once you sort of fell in love with the aesthetics, the sort of interest and knowledge behind it came.
What year are we talking, approximately?
2000, 2001.
So by the time you started, the internet was well underway, and the magazines were underway, so that you could then go and study it.
Yeah,
beyond...
magazines not so much. I mean, the idea at 21 of me walking into a newsagent's buying a watch magazine was like, no, that's not it. I was more of a car guy back then, so car magazines were probably the focus rather than watch. Yes, you're right, the internet was out there. I don't think I'd really discovered the internet forums and the chat groups so much. I certainly wasn't aware of the sort of mainstream media. It was more word of mouth.
But before you made this your career, after you left finance, what was your usual route for acquiring watches?
Collecting watches, I think you go through a phase. When you start collecting very early on, it's very easy to fall into the trap of saying, I'm looking for a reference. You sort of spend your life looking, hunting, you get frustrated, and you end up buying the wrong thing. So with all collections, your first 10, 14 watches, generally, you don't want to talk about. They're the ones where you cut your teeth, you make your mistakes. Yeah. What happened after that was, I started to buy watches that were quality, rather than reference. So you'd be patient, you'd find a watch, you have an idea of what you would kind of like, but you'd wait for the quality to come in. And I think even now, that is something that when people say to me, what do I look for in a vintage watch? First word has to be quality. You
spent how many years acquiring your knowledge, honing your knowledge, before you decided to leave finance for the role you've now undertaken?
15, 20 years.
And did you know in the back of your mind you were going to make it your career? You were going to replace finance?
Well, I knew at the time that I wanted to move into the watch sphere. I knew I had reached a point in my life where I wanted to do a job that I had a serious passion for, and that wasn't finance anymore. You have to sometimes look back and you say, right, now is the time for me to do that. At 38, I was young enough to do it. I felt I had the maturity to do it. I thought I had enough experience in life that it was the right time.
Before achieving this post, though, was there a gap between this and leaving finance?
No, not at all.
So you came into this straight from finance. So your skill set was background knowledge in watches combined with the state of the market.
Well, I think the unique thing we have here is that we are now approaching, in the UK specifically, an auction house which has a collector in it. Traditionally, people have come from other auction houses, and we've taken the approach of collectors come here knowing that they're now talking to a collector. So I've shared their problems, their pitfalls, their successes. I know London pretty well. I know the dealers, the auction houses, and the collectors. So there's a comfort there. And yes, you're right, I didn't have a gap, but there was no need for that. I think that the way that Phillips approaches auctions, from cataloguing through to, Orel's character is infectious. When Orel's at a rostrum, there is an energy in a room that is irreplaceable. Phillips has a reputation for finding watches of outstanding quality and provenance. In regards to that, we kind of aligned. What I wanted out of a vintage watch was what Phillips was offering me. So when I came to the decision of saying I'd like to be in industry, we had shared values. So it was, for me, the only people I really wanted to talk to was Orel.
For an outsider like myself, who's been watching the auction scene since it started, which would have been in the late 80s, the tenor has changed simply because the values have increased exponentially. How much of your financial background is going to influence how you steer, along with Orel, how you steer Phillips, because the numbers have become so huge? Is your financial background going to be a key factor in the way you operate?
Well, the great thing with the Phillips watch team is we have variety of skill sets. So we have people that used to be lawyers. I have a finance background. When you say to people you have a finance background, the first thing they say to you is, what do you think is the next Paul Newman? How do you think Rolex prices are going to go over the next 3 years? I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I do have, but I don't. The issue with that is you can go one of two ways. You can have an idea of how the watch market's going to evolve, but the macro picture in the world, we don't understand. We don't understand whether a president is going to be impeached. We don't understand whether there's going to be another banking crisis. So you can have an idea of how the watch market's going to go, but you have to combine it into a much bigger sphere. What I would say, though, is that if you have watches of the quality that we look for, you're always going to be ring-fenced to some degree from a downturn.
The main change in terms of auction dynamics, though, came through Phillips selling the Paul Newman.
Yeah.
If we look at watch history, there are maybe a dozen, 24 watches that are so historically important that nothing that follows them can alter that. For example, Steve McQueen's own Monaco, Rudolph Valentino's own Cartier. Now that the Paul Newman, the actual Paul Newman, has been sold, have we reached what we would call peak Paul Newman? Or are the lesser ones going to continue to ascend in price?
No, I think what was unique with the Paul Newman is it brought interest into the watch market that perhaps wasn't there. And I remember walking around London at the time of the auction, and people that you would never assume of being interested in watches saying that there's a Rolex for sale. People are talking $5-10 million. So all of a sudden, what the Paul Newman did was it reinforced in people's minds that vintage watches are an asset class, in the same way that we talk about classic cars, wine, art, etc. Now, what's interesting with the Paul Newman is if you take what happened and you go back and you kind of alluded to in your question as, what do you think is happening with prices now? Back in 2008, after Lehman Brothers, if you put $1 million into watches or cars or art or anything else, the numbers are exponential growth. If you had done that, you've got some comfort. But what I would say is that if you're entering the market now, the primary thing that should be driving your purchase is quality and provenance.
Unfortunately, with quality and provenance is a matter in many ways of luck. You find the watch that has been sitting in the back of the vault for 40 years.
Yeah.
And in many ways, though, the secondhand, vintage, whatever you want to call it, has been brand-led, where you would have Omega collectors, Rolex collectors, Patek collectors. Categorically now, Patek, Rolex, and Omega are so solidly established that there will probably be very few surprises. And the ascent over the last 3 to 5 years, joining them would be Hoyer.
Yeah.
Do you think there are any brands left that have that kind of potential? Because I, for years, have always wondered why, say, Longines is undervalued. Categorically, they don't have enough milestone models to create a sector. Perhaps Breitling, perhaps IWC. Are there any watches that if you were back out on the street that you would be hoarding, stockpiling for, say, even 5 years from now?
As a collector?
As a collector, yes.
I think that the market for what we call, or what we assume are the mainstream brands like Patek Philippe, like Rolex, the market has become very polarized.
Yes.
I think there are a lot of extremely good stainless steel sports watches still where there is potential for growth. But I think with all these things, tastes, fashions change. So what is fashionable now might not be fashionable in 2 years' time. We may see a resurgence in smaller watches. We may see a resurgence in early complicated chronographs and brands like Omega. I think a lot of it is fashion orientated. So it's hard to sort of say in the next 5 to 10 years, what are going to be the big winners? I think a lot of it depends on what the fashion is at the time and whether the market continues to be polarized in certain directions.
Well, at the risk of sounding like a conspiracy theorist, as long as I've been in the business for 40 years, there's always been a suspicion of maybe there's some kind of collusion going on. Now, we use the word fashion. Categorically, you have an event like Amiga Mania, which overnight made Amigas go up by 25 to 30 points.
Yep.
Then the other influences are great anniversaries. That's why Hoyer is having a great year. Do you think that the global network of the top level vintage watch dealers have the power to create the next trend because they have stockpiles?
No, I don't. I think when you say collusion, I would say education. And I think interest in certain brands and certain style of watches comes because the knowledge of them is far greater. You know, the interest in Rolex Daytonas has grown as the knowledge in Rolex Daytonas has also grown. The more watches that are handled and the more people start to do the background work behind it is when you start to see values rise. Why? Because as knowledge goes up, people start to become attracted to it. They have a comfort to it. We saw it last night with our Independence exhibition. That was a unique event in London where we sort of brought to London a collection, 30 manufacturers, unique exhibition in itself, explained how independents have a role to play in watchmaking, explained how they're unique in the way they approach watchmaking, and you know, again, you will start to see people start to have an interest in independence, which may lead to values increasing.